One and both pilots collapsed. Hired 3 times, 20 passengers, no communication, no help, and the only person who could save them was the woman in 12F whom everyone had ignored. The flight attendant had served her ginger ale without a second glance. The businessman beside her thought she worked in an office. No one suspected that F-22 fighter pilots would soon whisper her legendary call sign with awe. Before they watch the whole story, write down in the comments from which country you are watching. Do not forget to subscribe to receive more exciting stories. The woman in seat 12F looked completely ordinary. She wore comfortable jeans, a plain gray sweater, and white sneakers that had already seen better days. Her brown hair was tied back in a casual ponytail, and she had a worn paperback novel and one travel pillow with her. Nothing about her hinted at anything special. When the flight attendant, came by with the drinks cart, she ordered with a polite smile 1 ginger ale, just like dozens of other passengers. The flight attendant barely glanced at her as she handed over the plastic cup and already moved on to the next row. For all the passengers of Flight 2800 from Seattle to Boston, she was only one face among many, another tired traveler hoping for an uneventful flight across the country. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, at least that was what it said on her driver's license. The man in seat 12E had earlier tried to start a conversation and asked her whether she was traveling on business or private. She had vaguely answered something about a family visit, and he nodded before launching into a detailed explanation of his work in software sales. She listened politely, asked appropriate questions, and gave no sign that she had ever done anything more exciting than working in an office. When he asked what she did for a living, she said she worked in logistics, which technically was not a lie. The transport of fighter jets and the coordination of strike packages was a form of logistics, just not the kind most people imagined. What none of them knew, what the flight attendant serving coffee and the businessman discussing quarterly reports could not possibly guess, was that the unremarkable woman in 12F had a military past that would make even experienced pilots shake their heads in disbelief. Her real call sign, the one whispered in fighter squadrons from Nevada to Japan, was solo. She had earned it 15 years earlier during a mission over enemy territory when her wingman was hit and had to eject, so that she completed the strike package alone, dodged enemy fighters, and returned home through a sandstorm that had kept every other aircraft in the region on the ground. But that was only the beginning. In the following 10 years, Sarah became a kind of legend in circles that officially did not exist. She flew missions that never appeared in public records, landed damaged aircraft under impossible conditions on aircraft carriers, brought planes home that should have fallen from the sky, and hit targets that required a precision in flying that separates good pilots from truly exceptional ones. She had been a test pilot for 3 years, had pushed experimental aircraft to their limits and beyond, and learned to feel every vibration and every whisper of the air over the control surfaces. She had landed planes without hydraulics and without instruments, once even without landing gear on a foam-covered runway, while the engineers held their breath and watched. Her final mission, before retirement, had solidified her status as perhaps the best solo flyer in modern military aviation. Deep behind enemy lines, separated from her squadron by electronic warfare that had cut all communication, she had flown alone for 3 hours through hostile territory, reached her target, and returned on a route that led her between mountain peaks under conditions that would have filled most pilots with terror. When she finally landed, her commander had only stared at her and said, "Solo, you are either the bravest pilot I have ever met or the craziest." She had smiled and answered, "Why not both, sir?" But all of that now lay behind her. 6 months earlier, she had retired at the age of 42 with more flight hours and decorations than most pilots collect in their entire careers. She had turned down offers to become an instructor, to join private military companies, or to write books about her experiences. She wanted one normal life. She wanted to blend in. She wanted to be the woman in 12F who, with her ginger ale and her paperback novel, went unnoticed by everyone. The first 2 hours of the flight passed smoothly. The captain had announced over the intercom that they were flying at an altitude of 37,000 feet, and thanks to favorable tailwinds were well on time. Sarah had half dozed off and forgotten her book on her lap when she felt it. It was barely perceptible. Only a slight change in the engine noise, a tiny deviation in the vibrations running through the fuselage. She opened her eyes. Most passengers would have noticed nothing. The man beside her kept typing on his laptop. The mother across the aisle continued, reading to her little daughter. But Sarah's trained senses felt that something was wrong. She sat up straighter and listened carefully. There was again a brief fluctuation in the steady drone of the engines. Then the intercom clicked on and the captain's voice came on, although Sarah immediately noticed tension in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richardson. We have one small technical problem. There is no reason to worry, but as a precaution we will descend to a lower altitude. Flight attendants, please return to your seats." Sarah gripped the armrests. Small technical problem was, in pilot's language, one euphemism for something more serious than they wanted to tell the passengers. The flight attendants moved quickly to their jump seats, their professional, smiles not quite hiding their concern. Sarah felt the nose of the aircraft drop as they began the descent. She glanced out the window, noted that they were over the mountains of Montana, and checked the wing surfaces for any visible problem. Then, the intercom clicked again, but this time, no words came. It was one strange choked sound followed by something that sounded like a gasp, then silence. The line stayed open for several seconds. Nothing but silence. Then it was abruptly cut. Around her, the passengers began exchanging worried looks. The mother pulled her daughter closer. The businessman stopped typing. Sarah unfastened her seatbelt and stood up. A flight attendant up front noticed this immediately and called, "Ma'am, please remain seated and fasten your seat belt." "I need to speak with the captain," said Sarah in a calm voice but with an authority that made the flight attendant pause. "That is not possible at the moment. Please sit down." Sarah was already moving. Her entire demeanor had shifted from that of an ordinary passenger to something entirely different. The flight attendant wanted to stop her, but Sarah only said, "I am a military pilot. I need to check on the flight crew immediately." The flight attendant's eyes widened, but before she could answer, another flight attendant came out of the cockpit pale-faced. "Call for medical help," she said with a trembling voice. "Both pilots are unconscious. Something is wrong with them." In the cabin, frightened murmuring broke out. Sarah pushed past the flight attendant into the cockpit. What she saw there confirmed her worst fears. Captain Richardson was slumped forward against his harness, unconscious. The first officer leaned, back in his seat, eyes closed, breathing but not responding. In the cockpit there was a faint smell of something chemical, something that should not be there. Sarah's thoughts raced. Carbon monoxide? Some kind of vapor leak? It did not matter at the moment. What counted was that this Boeing 737 with 143 passengers and crew members on board was currently flying on autopilot without conscious pilots and was still descending. She glanced at the altimeter, 22,000 feet and falling. The autopilot was following the last command it had received. She reached for the radio. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 2800. We have a pilot emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. I am a passenger who has taken control of the aircraft." She waited for a response. She tried again on different frequencies. Still nothing. Then she noticed that the radio was displaying error codes for multiple systems. Something had disabled their communication equipment. Sarah stood alone in the cockpit, and for the first time in 6 months, she felt again the familiar weight of responsibility she had carried on so many missions. Only this time, there was no ejection seat and no parachute. 143 people were completely dependent on her, and she had no way to communicate with the ground, no way to receive instructions, no co-pilot to help her with the work. She was completely alone. She took a deep breath, slid into the captain's seat, and adjusted it quickly. The 737 was one different aircraft from the fighters she had flown, heavier and less responsive, but the principles were the same. She scanned the instruments to orient herself. The autopilot was still engaged, which was good. That gave her time to think. They were now at 19,000 feet and still descending at 1,500 feet per minute. She had to level the aircraft, assess the situation, and figure out where she could land. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. Over the panel, stopped the descent, and leveled the aircraft at 15,000 feet. She noted her position on the navigation display. They were over central Montana, miles from any major airport. She called up the moving map and searched for options. Billings was too far given their current position, and the fact that she had no idea how much time the pilot still had before whatever had affected them would affect her too. She needed a place that was closer. A flight attendant appeared at the cockpit door, her voice trembling. "What should we do? Should we tell the passengers?" Sarah kept her eyes on the instruments. "Tell them that we have the situation under control. Everyone should remain seated with their seatbelts fastened, and you need to set all the air vents in the cabin to maximum flow. Whatever affected the pilots came through the ventilation system. We have to flush it out. Are you sure you can fly this?" Sarah allowed herself one brief smile. "Yes, I can fly this." But it was not that simple. Flying was one thing. Landing a Boeing 737 without help, without communication, without a co-pilot to assist with the hundreds of tasks normally shared between two experienced airline pilots, was something else entirely. She had landed many aircraft alone before, but those had all been designed for single-pilot operation. The 737 had been built on the assumption that two trained professionals would work together, share the tasks, and support each other. She had to be both pilots. She had to fly the aircraft, navigate, configure it for landing, work through all the checklists, control the engines, the flaps, the landing gear, the speed, the altitude, and simply everything. And all of that while approaching an airport where she had never landed before, without guidance from the tower, without weather information, and without any way to coordinate with other aircraft in the area. Sarah's hands moved calmly over the controls. She had been in impossible situations before. The key was to break the task down, set priorities, and take one step at a time. Top priority: find a suitable airport. She studied the map display. 40 miles ahead lay one medium-sized airport, Great Falls International. It had long runways good enough for a 737. That was her target. She turned the aircraft toward Great Falls. Her fingers found the course selector and turned it gently. The 737 banked smoothly and took up the new heading. She checked the fuel. There were no problems with that. They had enough. She checked whether the engines were running normally. She methodically went through all the systems looking for further damage or malfunctions. Everything seemed normal except the communication systems, which had completely failed. 30 miles from the target, Sarah began the descent again, this time under her control. She reduced the thrust and felt the aircraft respond. The autopilot was still engaged for now, helping her maintain the exact altitude and direction, but she would have to fly the landing manually. There was no way around that. She needed to feel the aircraft, to sense what it was doing and make the tiny corrections that would bring it safely to the ground. She began going through the landing checklist in her head. She had to configure the aircraft step by step, extend the flaps in stages, lower the landing gear at the right moment, and maintain the correct speed in every phase. Normally, the flying pilot would call the settings and the monitoring pilot would execute them. She had to do both. Move her hands back and forth between the control column and the various switches and levers, never losing track of the aircraft's behavior. At 20 miles, she began the configuration. She reached for the flap lever and extended the flaps to position 1 as she felt the aircraft slow a little. Then she adjusted the power to maintain the descent rate. Her right hand rested on the thrust levers, her left on the control column. Her eyes moved between the instruments and the windshield, where she could now see the city of Great Falls ahead. At 15 miles, she disengaged the autopilot. The control wheel came alive in her hands and suddenly she was flying the 737. The aircraft responded differently from her fighters, heavier and more sluggish, but she adapted quickly. She made a small correction, felt the dynamics of the aircraft, and learned its characteristics. Every aircraft flew a little differently, had its own quirks and traits. She had to learn this one fast. Flaps. 5, she said aloud. The old habit of speaking her actions out loud came back automatically, even though no co-pilot was there to confirm. She reached with her right hand for the flap lever while her left hand kept control, extended them to the next position, felt the increased drag, and added more thrust to compensate. At 10 miles, she could see the airport clearly, 2 runways in an X shape. She would take the longer one, runway 03, which pointed northeast. The wind was coming lightly from the northwest, so she would have a slight crosswind, but nothing she could not handle. What concerned her more was the possibility of other traffic. Great Falls was a medium-sized airport. There could be other aircraft on approach. She had no way to warn them, no way to coordinate. She had to keep her eyes open and hope. Gear down, she called. Her hand found the landing gear lever and pulled it down. She felt the rumble as the massive wheels extended and locked. 3 green lights confirmed they were down and locked. Flaps 15. She extended them further and felt the aircraft slow and now need more power to maintain approach speed. At 5 miles, she was at 2,000 feet, perfectly positioned on the glide path. Her hands made constant small corrections to adjust for wind, speed, and altitude. She was now in the zone, in that state where everything else fell away and only she and the aircraft were connected and moving together. That was what she had always been good at, that pure connection between pilot and machine. Flaps 30, she said at 3 miles. The 737 slowed further and was now almost fully configured for landing. She checked her speed, 145 knots, exactly as it should be, altitude 1,000 feet. The runway lay ahead, one long strip of concrete growing larger. She could see hangars, terminal buildings, and a few parked aircraft, and then she saw the other aircraft, a small Cessna that had just taken off from the crossing runway 21. It was climbing, turning, and in about 30 seconds would cross directly through her approach path. Her heart rate did not increase. She had faced worse. She calculated quickly. She adjusted her descent rate slightly, increasing it just enough so that she would pass safely beneath the Cessna's climb path. Full flaps, she called it 500 feet. With the final flap setting, the 737 was fully configured. Now that she had committed to the landing, she made a small correction for a gust of wind and held the nose perfectly aligned with the runway center line. Her right hand hovered over the thrust levers, ready to add power if needed, ready to go around if something went wrong. However, since she had no co-pilot and reconfiguring the aircraft was very complex, a go-around would be far more dangerous than usual. At 200 feet, she began the flare, pulled the control wheel gently back, raised the nose slightly, and started the transition from descent to landing attitude. The runway came toward her. At 50 feet, she pulled the thrust levers to idle with her right hand, while her left hand continued to ease the control wheel back. She felt the ground beneath her. The main wheels touched almost silently. A perfect landing, right on the numbers. She lowered the nose wheel gently, then immediately deployed the spoilers with her left hand while her right hand returned to the thrust levers and pulled them into reverse. The roar of the reverse thrust filled the cockpit as the aircraft rapidly lost speed. Her feet worked the rudder pedals and kept the aircraft on the center line. She applied the brakes gently and felt the massive aircraft slow. They rolled down the runway, losing speed until they finally came to a stop 3,000 feet after the start of the 10,000-foot runway. She sat there for a moment, hands still on the controls, and breathed out deeply. Then she reached up and shut down the engines. The sudden silence was profound. Sarah sat in the captain's seat and allowed herself 5 seconds to feel the weight lift from her shoulders. Then, she was moving again. She had to get medical help for the pilots, get the passengers safely evacuated, and find out what had happened. She stood up and opened the cockpit door. In the cabin, applause broke out. The passengers were crying. Some were praying. Others simply stared at her in disbelief. The flight attendant who had earlier questioned her wiped the tears from her eyes. "You saved us," she whispered. "You saved everyone." Sarah shook her head. I only did what needed to be done. Now let's get medical help for the pilots and get everyone safely off the aircraft. Emergency vehicles were already racing toward the aircraft with flashing lights. Someone on the ground had seen the landing and understood it was an emergency. Within minutes, paramedics were on board treating the pilots, and the passengers were being evacuated via the emergency slides. What Sarah did not know was that her landing had not gone completely unnoticed. When Flight 2840 lost contact and air traffic control could no longer reach it, the protocols had kicked in. 2 F-22 Raptors, from Malmstrom Air Force Base, only 80 miles away, had launched to intercept the aircraft and assess the situation. They had just arrived as Sarah began her final approach. Major Jake Hawk Morrison had watched from 30,000 feet as the 737 made its approach. Tower, this is Raptor 11. I have visual contact with the target aircraft. It appears to be making an approach to Great Falls. No obvious distress signals. Understood, Raptor 11. We have no contact with that aircraft. The transponder is showing an emergency code. Hawk watched through his targeting system as the 737 descended, perfectly controlled, perfectly stable. Whoever was flying that thing knew what they were doing. He saw the landing gear come down and the flaps extend in stages. The aircraft held a perfect approach course. Then he saw the near collision with the Cessna. He saw how the Boeing adjusted its descent just enough to continue descending. Raptor 12, do you see that? He called to his wingman. Understood. That is impressive flying. Who was at the controls? No idea, but they can fly. They watched as the 737 touched down, soft as silk, rolled out, and came to a stop. Tower, the target aircraft has landed safely at Great Falls. The flight appears to be under control. Understood, Raptor 11. All good eyes return to base. But Hawk's curiosity was piqued. When he landed back at Malmstrom, he made a few calls. What he learned made him grab his wingman and drive straight to the operations center. The duty officer looked up as they entered. The situation for 2845? Hawk asked. Yes. Crazy story. Both pilots were incapacitated by some kind of vapor leak. One passenger landed the aircraft. Which passenger? The duty officer checked his notes. A passenger named Sarah Mitchell, who claimed to be military, took control of the aircraft. Can you check that name? Mitchell? Sarah? The duty officer typed the name into his terminal and then his eyes widened. Holy shit. She is in the system. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, retired. Call sign. He looked up at Hawk. Her call sign is Solo. Hawk felt his heart drop for a moment. Wait. The Solo? According to this list, yes. 17 years active duty, flew F-16 and F-18 combat missions, test pilot, instructor pilot. My God, her record is insane. Look at this mission list. Hawk leaned forward to read the screen, and with every line his respect grew. He had heard stories about Solo, legends really. Stories told in pilot bars about the flyer who could do the impossible. The sandstorm landing, the carrier landing without hydraulics, the Solo penetration mission everyone said was impossible. He had always thought they were exaggerated, that no one could really be that good. She landed a 737 all alone. His wingman drew a deep breath. No co-pilot, no communication. Apparently, Hawk slowly shook his head. And we just watched her do it. That approach was perfect, like out of the textbook. The duty officer continued reading. It says here she retired 6 months ago, turned down several offers to keep flying, wanted to move into civilian life. He looked up. She was just a passenger. She was on her way home. And then this happened. Hawk picked up the secure phone and dialed the fighter squadron at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, one of the most important training centers for fighter aircraft. When Colonel Sarah Viper Rodriguez answered, he said, Viper, this is Hawk at Malmstrom. I have to tell you something. What is it? Solo just landed a passenger aircraft alone. Both pilots went down. No radio contact. She saved 143 people. There was a long silence. Then Viper came back on with a quiet voice filled with something like awe. Solo did what? You heard? Me, correctly. Sarah Mitchell was a passenger on a 737. The pilots went down, she took over and landed at Solo. We watched from above. It was beautiful, Viper. Perfect. There was silence again. Then Viper said quietly, "Of course it was. It is Solo." Then, even quieter, "That is why she is Solo." The story spread like wildfire through the channels of military aviation. By evening, pilots at bases around the world had heard about it. The reactions were all similar. First disbelief, then confirmation, followed by a kind of reverent respect that pilots reserve only for the most exceptional of their colleagues. At Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, a group of F-22 pilots was in the briefing room when someone put the news footage up on the big screen. It showed the 737 on the ground. At Great Falls, emergency vehicles surrounding it, passengers being evacuated. The news anchor talked about the miracle landing by a mysterious passenger. One of the pilots, Captain Mike Frost Hansen, pulled up the military database on his tablet. "Wait, I have to check something." He typed quickly and then went completely still. "Guys, the passenger who landed the aircraft is named Sarah Mitchell. Her call sign is Solo." The room fell silent. Every head turned toward him. One of the experienced pilots, a lieutenant colonel with 20 years in fighters, stood up slowly. "Solo? As in Solo, the one?" The lieutenant colonel walked to the window and stared out at the F-22s on the flight line. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper, but everyone heard him. "Solo saved 143 people today. She landed a Boeing 737 completely alone, without help, without communication." He turned back to the room. "That is the kind of pilot she is. That is the kind of flyer we all want to be." Another pilot, a young captain who had just finished training, asked, Is she really that good? I have heard the stories, but..." The lieutenant colonel interrupted him. "The stories do not do her justice. I flew with Solo once years ago on a training exercise. I have never seen anyone handle an aircraft the way she does. It was not just flying. It was as if the aircraft was part of her, as if she could feel what it was thinking and what it was capable of in combat." He shook his head. "The stories are true, all of them." At Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, the story reached a squadron of F-22 pilots who had been on a training mission. When they landed and heard the news, their squadron commander, a colonel named Raymond Blade Wilson, called them together. "Listen, up. I have to tell you about a pilot. Her call sign is Solo. Today she accomplished something most of us could not do even with a full crew under perfect conditions. She landed a commercial airliner alone after both pilots became incapacitated, without help, without communication, just with her skill and her courage." He paused and looked at each of them. "Solo is the reason we train. She is the reason we push ourselves. She represents the absolute peak of what a pilot can be. And today, as a civilian, as an ordinary passenger, she proved it again. When I fly, when I practice emergency procedures, when I work to perfect my craft, I think about pilots like Solo because that is the standard. That is what exceptional looks like." One of his pilots raised a hand. "Sir, have you ever flown with her?" Blade smiled. "Once, 5 years ago. She was testing a new weapon system. I was her chase. She made that aircraft do things the engineers thought were impossible, and she made it look as smooth as child's play." He looked around the room again. She is retired now. She wanted a normal life. But today, when people needed her, she stepped up, and she did not just save them. She gave them a perfect landing, because that is what Solo does." The story continued to spread. The next day it had reached international fighter wings, RAF pilots at Lakenheath in England, French Rafale pilots at Saint-Dizier, Japanese F-15 pilots at Komatsu, German Eurofighter pilots at Neuburg. They had all heard about Solo in the airliner and reacted with the same quiet, deeply felt awe. Sarah Mitchell knew nothing of this. Just tired. "I heard what you did. The whole community has heard." Sarah sighed. "I just landed an aircraft. Viper, that is what we are trained for. Do not play it down. You landed a Boeing 737 alone, without a co-pilot, without communication. That is not just training, that is art, that is mastery. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Viper said firmly. "You did what only Solo can do. And every fighter pilot in the Air Force knows it. They are talking about you, Sarah. The F-22 guys who were on station and watched you, they are in awe. I have gotten calls from 3 different bases. Do you know what they say? What? They say your call sign and whisper it as if it were sacred. Because to them it is sacred. You embody something we all strive for. And today you proved why that call sign means what it means. Sarah felt tears come to her eyes. I just wanted to be normal. You can never be normal, Solo. You are extraordinary. And that is all right. Today you saved 143 people because you are extraordinary. Accept that. After she hung up, Sarah sat in the dark hotel room and thought about what Viper had said. She had spent her entire career being the best, pushing herself, taking on impossible missions, and earning that call sign through countless solo missions where everything depended on her alone. And now, even in retirement, even when she tried to stay anonymous, the same calling had found her again. 3 days later, back at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Hawk was flying a routine patrol when his radio crackled. Raptor 11, this is Raptor 27, I just wanted to say something. Say it. 27. There was a pause, then a voice he did not recognize, young and respectful, almost reverent. Solo landed the aircraft. I heard it was Solo. Hawk felt a smile cross his face. Confirmed. 27. It was her. Another pause. Then so quietly it was almost lost in the static. Solo. The way the young pilot said it, like a prayer, like an invocation, carried the weight of all the impossible things she had done, all the lives she had saved, all the missions she had completed when everyone else said it was impossible. In the weeks that followed, it became a tradition. The fighter pilots who heard her story would say her call sign once, quietly, and with the same reverence, not loudly. Not as a cheer, but as recognition of her mastery, her excellence, of a pilot who represented the absolute pinnacle of their profession. In ready rooms and cockpits, in briefing rooms and pilot bars, the story was told again and again. The female passenger who had seemed so ordinary, who had been overlooked by everyone, who had been just one face in the crowd until the moment when lives were at stake, when the impossible was required, when someone alone had to fly an aircraft and save everyone on board. And she had done it, not just done it, but done it perfectly. And at bases around the world, in the cockpits of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, pilots who pushed themselves to the highest levels, who trained for impossible scenarios, who lived for the moment when their skills would be tested, heard this story and whispered her call sign with an understanding that went beyond words. Because Solo had not just landed an aircraft that day, she had shown everyone what peak performance looks like. She showed what a single pilot with masterful command of their craft can achieve. She proved that all the hours of training, all the striving for perfection, all the commitment to being prepared for anything, all of it mattered. When the moment came, when people needed her, she was ready. They got F-22 pilots whispered her name because they understood what it meant. They flew the most advanced fighters in the world, aircraft whose control demanded incredible skill. They were the elite of the elite, and they recognized in Solo someone who operated at a level even above their own, someone who had achieved such complete mastery that she could fly an unfamiliar aircraft in an impossible situation and make it look easy. Sarah Mitchell eventually returned to her quiet life. She declined all interview requests, turned down the awards, and avoided the spotlight. She had never done it for the fame. She had done it because people needed help, and she could help them. That was enough. But in the community of fighter pilots, her legend grew. New pilots completing their training would eventually hear this story. They would be told about Solo, about the airliner, about the perfect solo landing. And they would understand that somewhere out there was a pilot who represented the absolute standard, the peak of what was possible. And knowing that she existed, that someone had reached that level, inspired them to push themselves even harder, train better, aim higher. Years later, a young F-22 pilot named Lieutenant Sarah Chen was on patrol when she heard her instructor, a veteran with 15 years of fighter experience, say quietly over the radio, If you ever wonder how good a pilot can be, think of Solo. Think of the airliner. She landed alone. That is the standard. That is what we strive for. And Lieutenant Chen pressed the transmit button on her microphone and answered with the same quiet reverence in her voice. Solo. The word hung in the air for a moment, transmitted over military radio frequencies, spoken with muted awe by those who understood what it meant. Not just a call sign, not just a name, but a symbol of mastery, of excellence, of a pilot who alone could make the impossible possible. Because that is what Solo meant. When everyone else needed help, she flew alone. When the situation was impossible, she made it possible. When lives depended on perfection, she delivered perfection. And fighter pilots around the world, the best of the best, the elite flyers who dominated the skies in the most advanced aircraft ever built, heard her name and whispered it like a blessing, like a goal, like a reminder of what they all tried to become. Solo. The woman who landed the aircraft alone. The legend who, through her masterful command of her craft, saved 143 lives. The pilot whose call sign would still be whispered with awe generations later.